Are you calling my entire community a threat to Western civilization? Zohran Mamdani's voice sliced through the tension like broken glass. The room fell into a stunned silence. Across from him, Douglas Murray sat back, lips curled into the faintest smirk, as if he'd just triggered a trap he'd spent years setting. It was supposed to be a civil panel discussion, an elite, invitation-only event at the Royal Institute for Strategic Studies in London, held in the grand marble hall that once echoed with Churchill's footsteps. The chandeliers still trembled with the heat of the cameras. The topic: crisis and cohesion in the West. What it became was a slow-motion detonation of assumptions, identities, and moral authority. So what did Douglas say that pushed Zohran to the edge? He leaned forward earlier that evening, polished and deliberate. The problem, you see, isn't immigration per se. It's the type of immigrant. Some values simply don't integrate. And unfortunately, we see that most clearly in communities from South Asia and the Middle East. It was dressed in civility, wrapped in academic language, applauded by a few nodding heads in the front row. But Zohran had heard every syllable like it was a nail being hammered into a coffin labeled them. So now, on camera, in front of politicians, scholars, and streaming millions, he asked again, "You speak of values. Which ones? Dignity, equality, or the unspoken value that some lives are worth more than others?" Murray smiled faintly. "Let's not play rhetorical games, Zohran. You know precisely what I mean. The West thrives on freedom of speech, on reason, on tolerance. These are not universally held." "You mean," Zohran said slowly, rising from his chair, "that my mother, who taught ESL classes to newly arrived refugees for 2 decades, didn't understand freedom? That my father, who risked his life as a cab driver every night in this very city, didn't value reason?" The moderator shifted uncomfortably. Cameras zoomed in. Murray blinked but held the line. "And you? Watching this right now, what would you have said in Zohran's place? When centuries of displacement, of prejudice, of polite exclusion finally erupt in one brutal moment of truth, how do you respond? Do you stay quiet to keep your seat at the table, or do you flip the table?" The audience didn't expect the next words, because what Zohran did next wasn't a rebuttal. It was something far more dangerous. He turned to the audience, not to Murray, not to the moderator, to them. "For too long," he said, voice firm but trembling with rage, "we've let people speak about us, without us. You write op-eds, deliver lectures, collect fees for dissecting the problem of people like me. But let me make one thing very clear. We're not your sociological experiment. We are the West." That line cracked something open. In the back row, someone started to clap. Then another. Then, slowly, the room that had once felt like an exclusive cathedral of power turned into a courtroom of reckoning. But it didn't stop there, because Murray, visibly rattled for the first time, leaned in and whispered into his mic, "You wouldn't dare quote the Quran in here, would you?" And Zohran did, not to provoke, not to convert, but to reclaim space. He quoted a verse his grandmother used to recite when the world seemed to forget their worth. "Do not let the hatred of others make you swerve to wrong and depart from justice. Be just. That is closer to righteousness." And with that, centuries of silencing collapsed into a single breath. If you're watching this now and think politics is just about votes and sound bites, ask yourself, what happens when someone finally stops asking for permission to exist? If this moment shook you even a little, hit subscribe and tell me in the comments, what would you have said in Zohran's place? The silence after Zohran quoted the verse wasn't just silence. It was displacement, of authority, of control, of the careful balance that kept voices like his at the margins. Douglas Murray blinked, his usual composure dented for a fleeting second. He shifted in his seat, and for the first time, he looked uncertain whether to speak or stay quiet. The moderator finally cleared his throat. Thank you, Mr. Mamdani, for that passionate response. Perhaps we can return to the original topic. But it was already too late for original topics. A young woman in the audience stood up, not waiting for a microphone. Why is it, she asked, that every time someone speaks truth to power, it's called passion? But when that same power speaks with cruelty, it's called analysis? Another person stood, then another, and another. The hall, designed for control, was becoming a site of protest, orderly, still within the rules, but entirely out of the old guard's control. Murray's voice cut in, sharp, defensive. Let's not allow the room to descend into a moral circus. There is still such a thing as civil discourse, Mr. Mamdani. You, of all people, should understand the value of restraint. Zohran turned back toward him slowly. I do, he said. I understand restraint. I was raised on it. Restraint is what my parents showed when landlords refused to rent to them. Restraint is what I showed when someone spit on me in the subway and said I should go back to where I came from. Restraint is what my community has practiced every single time a newspaper editorial describes us as a demographic threat. He paused. But maybe restraint is a privilege you demand from those you don't have to listen to. There it was, the raw, unfiltered truth of it, and yet Murray doubled down, his voice rising just slightly. If the West is so intolerable, so hostile, why do people from your background fight to come here? You speak of injustice while enjoying every benefit this society offers. Isn't that the very definition of hypocrisy? Zohran didn't react immediately. He let the question hang in the air like poison. Then he asked something no one expected. Do you know the name Yasmin Ahmed? Murray furrowed his brow. Should I? She was a Somali refugee, Zohran said. She arrived in the UK as a child. She worked her way through school. She cared for her siblings while her mother worked night shifts. She made it to university on scholarship, became a lawyer, and spent 5 years defending immigrant women in domestic violence cases. She was born in a war zone and died of COVID in a London hospital because she didn't have access to proper PPE while working a frontline job. He looked straight at Murray. You ask why we come here? We come here to survive. And when we do, we rebuild your society from the ground up. But we die quietly. And you write books about us. The audience was still again. But this time the tension wasn't about discomfort. It was about exposure. The rules had been bent. Something dangerous had begun. Moral clarity in a place designed for polite ambiguity. Murray leaned forward, clearly trying to take back control. You've personalized a political discussion. That's not debate. That's performance. But Zohran wasn't interested in debating anymore. This isn't performance. This is testimony. And your refusal to recognize it is exactly why so many people have stopped trusting these rooms, these platforms, and these so-called intellectual gatekeepers. And then he did something radical. He walked down from the stage and handed the microphone to the young woman who had first stood up. She introduced herself as Sarah, the daughter of Algerian immigrants, a nurse who had just come off a double shift. Do I get to speak? She asked. The crowd murmured, unsure, and Zohran replied simply, That's what this should have been about all along. What followed wasn't a shouting match. It was a reckoning. One by one, people in the audience began standing, not with slogans, but with stories. Stories of exclusion masked as policy, of silence mistaken for consent, of generations treated as case studies instead of citizens. And Douglas Murray? He watched, for once, without the final word. If you believe stories matter more than spin, if you think reclaiming space is an act of courage, don't scroll past this. Tap like, subscribe, and tell me, when was the last time you saw someone refuse to be spoken for? The organizers didn't know what to do. What had started as a highly curated panel with predictable talking points had morphed into something they hadn't scripted. The people in the audience were no longer spectators. They were participants. And in their voices, nurses, students, cleaners, postal workers, was a depth of experience no think tank white paper could manufacture. Some attendees tried to leave, unsettled, but many stayed, pulled in by something they couldn't name yet. A shift, a rupture, a moment of clarity that, once seen, couldn't be unseen. Zohran sat quietly among the crowd now, not towering above them on stage, but among them, listening. His phone buzzed non-stop. News alerts, social media mentions. A short clip of his Quran quote had already gone viral. A hashtag was trending, #We're the West. Back on stage, Douglas Murray remained seated, arms folded, brow tense. He hadn't left, but he hadn't spoken again either. He watched as his usual ground, the polite arena of detached debate, slipped away from him. It wasn't just that he was being challenged, it was that his language, his rhythm, his terrain, was no longer the default. Someone else now held the room. An older man stood to speak, his accent thick with East London grit. "I'm not a religious man," he began. "I've voted Tory all my life. But I'll tell you what I do know. The night my son came home with a fractured jaw because he stood up for a Muslim classmate in school, that night I realized something. The problem ain't immigration. It's cowardice. Cowardice of the kind that lets people speak hate and call it heritage." No applause. Just breathless agreement. A woman in a headscarf followed, sharing a story about losing her job after refusing to remove it, even though she had the highest customer service reviews in her department. Another woman, white, mid-60s, nodded and added, "She trained me when I started. She was the best damn supervisor we ever had. I quit the day they let her go." It was no longer a panel. It was a reckoning, and Zohran was at the center of it, not as a performer, not as a pundit, but as a catalyst. Suddenly Murray spoke again, more quietly this time. "You're not wrong to feel angry," he said. "But are we really saying that tradition, cultural identity, even nationhood, are obsolete ideas? That they don't matter at all anymore?" Zohran turned to him calmly. "No," he said. "I'm saying they matter too much to leave in the hands of those who only define them by exclusion." And for the first time, Murray didn't interrupt. That's when the moderator, clearly overwhelmed, suggested a 5-minute recess. Cameras kept rolling, but people stood, stretched, whispered, tweeted. A journalist from a major outlet approached Zohran. "This wasn't supposed to happen," she said. "You hijacked the narrative." He smiled faintly. "No," he replied. "I gave it back to the people you wrote out of it." Outside, reporters clustered by the entrance. The Prime Minister's communications office had called twice. Rumors swirled that a certain cable news anchor in the U.S. wanted Zohran on live tonight. But he wasn't interested in media cycles. Instead, he turned to the young woman from earlier, Sarah, and asked, "Do you want to go back in there with me?" She nodded. Back inside, the room hadn't emptied. It had grown. Word had spread. Staffers let in people who'd been waiting outside. A few more stood along the walls. Something rare was unfolding. The illusion of neutrality had cracked, and no one wanted to miss what came next. And what came next wasn't fury, it was focus. Zohran stepped back up, not alone this time, but flanked by voices that had been invisible just an hour before. He didn't shout. He didn't gloat. He asked a question. Who decides whose pain is political and whose pain is just noise? The room was still again, and that silence, unlike earlier, was not discomfort. It was attention. If you've ever been told your experience is too emotional for serious spaces, if you've ever been shut down with words like objective, rational, respectable, this moment is for you. If it hit home, hit subscribe, and let me know in the comments. Who's been written out of your story? The final moment didn't arrive with a bang, but with something far more unsettling. Truth spoken without fear. Zohran Mamdani stood center stage again, not by design, but because no one else dared speak after him. Even Douglas Murray had fallen silent, not defeated, but displaced. He had come to this stage expecting to debate ideology. What he got instead was a reckoning with lived reality. And the thing about lived reality is, it doesn't ask for your permission. Zohran looked across the room and said calmly, "This is not a debate. This is a mirror. And if it frightens you, maybe it's time to ask what you've become so afraid to see." There was no anger in his voice anymore, just clarity. And when clarity enters a room built on complexity, it feels like heresy. He turned to Douglas Murray. "You built a career on elegant fear. You package it well, British diction, expensive suits, Oxford commas, but peel it back, and it's still fear. Of change, of difference, of a world where you are no longer the sole narrator." Douglas shifted in his seat, not indignantly, almost reflectively. Zohran continued, "I don't hate you. I don't even want to silence you. I just refuse to let you be the only voice people hear when they ask, 'What is the West?'" And then, without waiting for a response, he turned to the audience, not just those in the room, but through the live stream, the millions watching around the world. "My name is Zohran Mamdani. I'm a New Yorker. I'm a legislator. I'm the son of immigrants, and I belong here, not in spite of who I am, but because of it." There was no applause line, no dramatic crescendo, just that statement, clear, undeniable, whole. But what happened next was something no one could have predicted. Douglas Murray stood up. He didn't speak. He didn't argue. He didn't try to reclaim control. He simply walked down from the stage, stopped in front of Zohran, and said softly, audible only because every camera zoomed in and every microphone strained, "I still disagree with you, but today I heard you, and that rarely happens in these rooms." Zohran nodded. "Then maybe," he said, "this was worth it." It wasn't about agreement. It never was. It was about visibility, dignity, the refusal to be patronized, caricatured, or managed. And as the event ended, not with a scheduled closing statement, but with people still speaking, still sharing, still lingering, the headlines had already begun to spread. Mamdani redefines the debate on Western values. From clash to conversation, a new politics emerges in London. Zohran Mamdani doesn't ask for a seat, he builds the table. Later that night, clips from the panel flooded social media. Not the usual 15-second sound bites, full testimonies, raw voices, real pain and unpolished truth. Young organizers began sharing quotes. Elder immigrants cried watching their experiences finally spoken aloud. Even those who had once feared change said, "I didn't expect to feel this moved." But most powerful of all was the message Zohran received from a 17-year-old boy in Birmingham. "I used to be ashamed of my name, but today I saw someone say it with pride and make a room full of power listen. Thank you." And in that message, in that quiet gratitude, lay the final proof of what had just happened. This wasn't just a viral moment. It was a cultural shift. Because every empire that built itself on exclusion eventually forgets how to listen. And every moment like this reminds them, the future isn't asking for permission. It's arriving, loud, brilliant, unfiltered. And Zohran Mamdani? He didn't win a debate. He rewrote the rules entirely. If this story moved you, even just a little, subscribe. Then tell me in the comments, what kind of future are you willing to speak into existence? Because silence never built justice. But truth? It just might.